Yes.
Okay. So today what I'll be talking about includes criminalization of same-sex practices, sex work, and non-disclosure of HIV transmission. And so let's start off with what is intersectionality. And so at the heart of this concept, which I'm sure you've all heard of because it's growing in popularity, is that we all hold multiple identities that are woven together and shape our life experiences. And we cannot disentangle the ways that our race, gender, class, sexuality, ability, among other identities and experiences, shape our life opportunities in our social worlds. So I'm also sure some of you may have already read this, but the Combahee River Collective, this is written in 1977, describes that we are actively committed to struggling against racial, sexual, heterosexual, and class oppression. The major systems of oppression are interlocking. The synthesis of these oppressions create the conditions of our lives. What is also less focused on when we discuss intersectionality today are the strengths, resilience, resistance, and solidarity at the intersections of multiple identities. Without attending to the strength and ways that communities are navigating inequalities, we may not realize the potential ways in which we can work together to challenge oppression in our laws, policies, and programs, and even in the way we form relationships with one another. So what does this have to do with HIV and sexual health? I first really came to understand the concept of intersectionality while conducting a qualitative study looking at stigma experienced by women living with HIV across Ontario a decade ago when I was a PhD student. I knew when I first looked at the draft interview guide for the focus groups that something was missing. And as researchers and practitioners, we often control what questions are asked and what answers we listen to. And I've constantly been thinking about this, that we only get what we ask for. So if we only followed that interview guide that only had questions of stigma, those are the stories that we're going to get, but they're not actually reflecting people's entire lives. And so my social work side came out and I added those questions about how people are resisting and coping and living and managing in the face of stigma. And so not only did women living with HIV talk about HIV stigma, they talked about sexism and racism and sex work stigma and drug use stigma and homophobia and transphobia, and ways that were complex and interconnected. Sex workers we talked to discussed sex work stigma from doctors and healthcare providers, and HIV stigma within social networks and for those who experience incarceration. African, Caribbean, and Black, lesbian, and bisexual women talked about heteronormativity within support groups for HIV-positive women that assumed everyone was straight and cisgender, and HIV stigma in lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans groups, and racism within health systems and everywhere. The complexity of these stories changed the course of my work and made it possible to only move forward from a place that explored these intersections. Yet the question about how people cope, survive, manage stigma and social exclusion was equally powerful and revealed the importance of noticing the ways in which people adapt and manage, build networks and communities of reciprocity, and advocate not only against oppressions they're experiencing, but against other forms of marginalization. So intersectionality in HIV and sexual health research can approach categories of identities in different ways. These include an anti-categorical approach, rejecting the idea of categories. Is there really such a thing as gender or race? Are these socially constructed? Intercategorical, so looking at inequality between social groups, for example, between people living with HIV and HIV-negative people, between heterosexual or lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer people. And intra-categorical approaches, which look at the lived experiences at the intersection of marginalization. So among people living with HIV, what are the differences based on race, sex work involvement, class? The final thing I would like to share to contextualize the talk today is from this conceptual figure. This was just published 2 days ago, actually. On the bottom, you can see that there's drivers and facilitators. So I wanted to bring this up because the focus today is on criminalization. So drivers is how stigma is shaped at the individual level, a lack of awareness of stigma and its impact, fears, and stereotypes. And facilitators is what impacts stigma at the societal level, including laws and policies, cultural and gender norms. Thus, criminalization of people and practices is a stigma facilitator that, as this figure displays, intersects with marginalized identities and ultimately reduces access to justice and compromises health and healthcare access. So as Jeannie mentioned, I'll be taking you to different contexts in the world to show some of the similarities and differences in how criminalization impacts sexual health. So the first example I'll share is about criminalization of same-sex practices. So across the world, same-sex practices are criminalized across 72 countries. I think I just read that Angola may have decriminalized, so it might be 71 right now. Legal practices constrain LGBT persons' rights, for example, via criminalization of same-sex practices and laws that do not protect LGBT persons from stigma and discrimination they may face. So even in the United States, there's no national protection from discrimination based on sexual and gender identity. And this affects people's access to education, employment, housing, and justice. So sexual rights are the ability to feel and express our sexuality, to have pleasurable and safe sex without experiencing discrimination, violence, or coercion. So this is a WHO figure, and encircling what is considered to be sexual rights includes sexuality, gender and socioeconomic status, human rights, and laws, policies, and strategies. So the first example I'm going to give, and if you would like more detail, I can send you publications, so I'm just giving you an overview today, is a study we conducted in Swaziland, where same-sex practices are criminalized. So Swaziland is a small mountain kingdom in southern Africa. Swaziland, like many other places in sub-Saharan Africa and globally, has a rich history of same-sex practices before European colonization and introduction of colonial laws criminalizing these practices. Same-sex practices are a common law offense in Swaziland, and there have been convictions. In LGBT individuals and communities, the reason that I don't always say LGBTQ is if people where I worked with did not identify as queer. So I'm trying to keep the language consistent with how people identify in different contexts. So LGBT individuals and communities are largely invisible because of this hostile context. In turn, their invisibility is used to justify the state's failure to reform the laws and challenge discrimination. For example, in 2012, the Minister of Justice and Constitutional Affairs responded to critics from the United Nations Working Group on Human Rights regarding inequality and violence experienced by LGBT persons in Swaziland by asserting that Swaziland did not need to protect the rights of gay people as they did not exist in the country. So criminalization of same-sex practices can produce this exclusion that's institutionalized in families, communities, and in the legal system. So the Rock of Hope organization was a community partner in the research, founded in 2012 to provide social support to LGBT persons, families, non-discrimination training, and then it ended up being HIV and education and awareness. So we had conducted in-depth interviews with 51 people across the LGBT spectrum. And participants' narratives reflected complex processes of marginalization. So structural marginalization included the intersection of legal discrimination and healthcare barriers. Community marginalization included stigma and violence targeting LGBT persons from community members and families. And internal marginalization through internalizing the stigma and low self-esteem and low self-acceptance. So these all interacted in complex ways that elevated HIV exposure, yet reduced access to health information and health services. I'm only going to be giving a few examples for the sake of time, so I'm focusing on structural marginalization. So criminalization of same-sex practices was a collective experience that left LGBT persons feeling as if they had unequal access to health resources. So in general, it's illegal in the country, this person, gay man described, so we're scared to come out. And because we're not legal, people are afraid to go to the health centers for medication. And that contributes to HIV. And the reason I'm going to give this example in the first quote is that this almost exact word for word has come up in our work in Jamaica for 3.5 years. It came up with our work in Lesotho. So I think it's really important to think that when people don't have rights of legal protection, they experience mistreatment by healthcare providers. And so the following example, as I said, is so pervasive that I added it. So it becomes difficult to show the nurse you have an STI in your anus. Health personnel have a tendency of making fun of persons. They leave you in the room and they call one another to laugh and make fun of you. This is so common in all of the work in various contexts that we've experienced working with people. And taking into consideration intersectionality, people describe there's even less understanding of trans issues, and more difficulties to accessing health care. So as I mentioned earlier, an intersectional perspective also examines the way that people persist, resist, and navigate oppression. So there are many examples of the way that LGBT persons in Swaziland did this. To navigate systems that marginalize LGBT people, people described accessing and sharing HIV resources with one another, providing and receiving peer support, and personal journeys to self-acceptance. And social media did play a role in this. So some people looked at the internet and Facebook to find out what are they supposed to do to protect themselves when they're having sex with men. And others described sharing information with healthcare workers to create change in the way that LGBT people are treated. And solidarity and community support are also very important to consider. And so people discuss supporting each other in various ways, spending social time, sharing the good and the bad in their lives, and older persons discuss the ways they supported younger persons. So a support structure among ourselves. We help younger ones with coping for those of us who have come to accept our sexuality. And this often included accompanying one another to HIV testing, where persons going alone may have experienced mistreatment. So a lesbian described how she'd go along for HIV testing with her gay man friend who would be mistreated when he went alone. Friends also had HIV testing packs. So I go for HIV testing quite often. We have a Cinderella pact with my friends. We test every month. And so in the face of criminalization and stigma, persons found different paths to self-acceptance. Sometimes this came through support from LGBT persons and support groups. And this emerged as an important aspect for persons to access healthcare. So trans women described how this self-acceptance was a key to expressing her needs to healthcare providers. So for this example, to sum up, the criminalization of same-sex practices provided a backdrop where healthcare stigma and discrimination were pervasive and community stigma and violence were legitimized. So living in these social worlds contributed to social isolation and self-stigma. Yet the examples I showed demonstrate how people challenge these contexts in many ways. So the second case study is around criminalization of sex work and same-sex practices. So a lot of the work that we did with lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans persons showed that those who were involved in sex work experienced more stigma, more violence, and so therefore we did a second study, which I'll be talking about today, with gender diverse sex workers. So sex workers experience criminalization, rights violations, and violence, and when this is combined with a lack of legal protection, it elevates risk of HIV exposure. And so much current literature on violence and sexual health among sex workers in middle-income countries focuses on cisgender women sex workers. However, there is a substantial proportion of sex workers, I would suggest everywhere in the world, who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, LGBTQ. And so they experience an increased risk of violence due to stigma and discrimination based on the intersection of sexual orientation and gender identity. And Jamaica is another country where same-sex practices are criminalized as a legacy of British colonial rule, and sex work is also criminalized. So AIDS is Jamaica's leading cause of death for persons aged 18 to 49, and the Caribbean is the global region most impacted by HIV following sub-Saharan Africa. And gay and bisexual men's HIV prevalence is estimated at 33%, which is 19-fold higher than the general population prevalence. And so there's a complexity of violence that targets sex workers: gender-based violence, intimate partner violence, and physical and sexual violence by clients, coworkers, and police. And so across many global contexts, and Dr. Kate Shannon's work has also demonstrated this, policing practices are associated with increased violence among sex workers, lower condom use, access and uptake, and less access to health care. And substance use may be a coping strategy for violence and social exclusion. So in this study, we explored multiple forms of violence among gender diverse sex workers and pathways to sexual health outcomes. So we conducted a community-based research study with Jamaica AIDS Support for Life, which celebrated their 27th year anniversary recently, and in Kingston, Ocho Rios, and Montego Bay, where they actually have HIV clinics. They do advocacy with police systems, healthcare systems, and we also collaborated with the Sex Workers Association of Jamaica. We worked with LGBTQ people and including sex work involved LGBTQ people as peer research assistants, and then I'm just going to briefly present some findings from a cross-sectional survey we did. And so really what we were looking at were the pathways from different forms of violence and the connections between different forms of violence, including police harassment, intimate partner violence, and client violence, and consistent condom use, how those might be associated with condom use efficacy, which is people's ability to feel like they have power to have safe sex, to use condoms, to access condoms. And then we also looked at the effect of binge drinking, which we had identified in our previous research. And so our survey included cisgender men, cisgender women, and trans women. And half experienced police harassment. Over 1/3 experienced past 6-month client violence, and then past 6-month intimate partner violence. Yet from an intersectional perspective, it's important to consider the differences in experiences of violence among this group of gender diverse sex workers. And so we saw that police harassment was significantly higher among trans women than cis men or cis women sex workers. Intimate partner violence was significantly higher among cis women than cis men or trans women. And client violence was also higher among trans women than cis men or cis women. So what this figure shows is a few things. It shows that police harassment, intimate partner violence, and client violence were all associated with one another. So people who are experiencing police harassment were also very likely to report intimate partner violence and experiencing violence from clients. We saw that police harassment had a direct and strong effect on consistent condom use, so reducing the ability for people to practice consistent condom use. And these 3 forms of violence were associated with the lower ability of people to negotiate safer sex and to access condoms and use condoms. And that binge drinking was associated with client violence and reduced condom use efficacy. So the considerations that I wanted to raise from this study include there's high levels of violence across multiple sources. And there's, what I didn't have time to present today was our qualitative research, which really shows people's experiences trying to access justice, which they could not access justice. So if people went to the police, and I'm happy to share this work with you that we've published, they would be ridiculed at the very least. At the most, they might experience bribery, sexual assault, and physical assault. So there was really no access to justice despite experiencing multiple forms and types of violence. And violence had complex associations with sexual health and ability to use and negotiate condoms. And we really should look at polyvictimization, so that multiple ways that people are experiencing violence in their lives. So you might be thinking, what does this have to do with me here in Vancouver? Well, I'd suggest that LGBT people migrate due to impacts of criminalization, of sexual stigma, and people do come to Canada. In our qualitative study with Black Coalition for AIDS Prevention in Toronto, we identified that when LGBT people migrate, they still often face social isolation, racism, immigration-related stressors, mental health challenges, and barriers to meeting the social determinants of health, like food and housing. We found that Black CAP social support groups for LGBTQ newcomers and refugees provided information and emotional support to navigate these challenges, once again underscoring the importance of recognizing solidarity and reciprocity. And last year I was contacted by lawyers to provide an expert witness testimony to support the case of a transgender woman's asylum claim from Jamaica. So LGBT migration, the movement of LGBT persons, often away from criminalizing contexts that were largely instilled by colonial powers, has been occurring in Canada since 1991. And so our world and our sexual rights remain interconnected. And so the final case I wanted to discuss was Canada's overcriminalization of HIV. And what can an intersectional approach tell us about Canada's criminalization of HIV? So gender-based violence places women at an increased exposure to HIV. And once women are living with HIV, women are at risk for violence following disclosing their HIV status. So the current law for provinces states that without disclosure of one's HIV-positive serostatus, a person must have both an undetectable viral load and use a condom, which, just a reminder, is a prevention technology largely controlled by men. And so this, I'm sure many of you are aware that this law does not reflect the current science around U equals U or undetectable equals untransmissible. So our work with women living with HIV in Canada through CHIWO, so the Canadian HIV Women's Sexual and Reproductive Health Cohort Study, in Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia, identified forced sex as the third most common mode of HIV acquisition among women living with HIV. So the first most common mode of HIV acquisition was consensual sex. The second was share at 52%. The second was sharing needles at 20%. And the third most common mode of HIV acquisition was forced sex at 17%. But an intersectional perspective also lets us see that these experiences differed among women living with HIV. So persons who were landed immigrants versus citizens, who were African, Caribbean, or Black versus Caucasian or white, who had a history of living in a group home or foster care, were more likely to report forced sex as a mode of HIV acquisition. So as I mentioned earlier, there's a large body of evidence suggesting that disclosure is associated with increased risk of violence. So requiring HIV disclosure from women, many who have already experienced gender-based violence, has a potential to reproduce violence. And so this is one of our analyses. We found 80% of women reported experiencing violence over the age of 16. 1/5 reported recent violence in the past 3 months. That's 1/5, 22%. I just want to repeat that because I think it's really disturbing. 22% of women living with HIV in a sample of 1,400 reported violence in the past 90 days. So this is really an epidemic. And HIV stigma, you see, is associated with recent adulthood violence. So we actually ran this analysis looking at any lifetime violence in adulthood, and HIV stigma wasn't associated with it. So this really suggests that recent violence in a different way is associated with HIV-related stigma. You can also see that HIV-related stigma, gender, and racial discrimination are associated with one another. And gender discrimination is also associated with recent adulthood violence. This is another example of intersectionality. So these forms of stigma and discrimination are interconnected, and multiple forms are associated with recent violence. The second important consideration about this non-disclosure directive is how HIV stigma impacts people's lives in profound ways, including their ability to navigate complex disclosure concerns, and in fact, their ability to start, maintain, and adhere to antiretroviral therapy, or ART. And for most people, ART adherence is required for maintaining an undetectable viral load. So we modeled different dimensions of HIV-related stigma and found that experiencing mistreatment due to your HIV status, what's known as personalized or enacted stigma, was associated with lower likelihood of ever starting and currently being on antiretroviral therapy. It also contributed to depression that in turn reduced the likelihood of adherence. And secondly, negative self-image, which you can see is connected to negative public attitudes towards people living with HIV, is connected to experiences of mistreatment, was also associated with a lower likelihood of ever starting antiretroviral therapy. It was also related to depression, and in turn, lower ART use and adherence. So if people are experiencing mistreatment and poor self-image that reduce the likelihood of ever starting and currently using antiretroviral therapy and lower adherence, what does that mean with the focus on reaching an undetectable viral load? So I went to answer that question. We found that stigma was associated with HIV outcomes, but what about this intersectional stigma? This is kind of complicated, but I'll describe it. So HIV-related racial and gender discrimination were connected again, and stigma was associated with reduced support from social networks, from institutions that contributed to depression. Depression was associated with lower resilient coping, and that partly accounted for a detectable viral load. And it was also associated with increased injection drug use that in turn contributed to a detectable viral load and lower CD4 count. So taken together, the context of women's lives make navigating HIV criminalization extremely complicated. Gender-based violence reduces sexual relationship power to even negotiate condom use. Intersectional stigma contributes to poor adherence via depression, and HIV stigma is a barrier to starting and currently being on antiretroviral therapy, as well as to disclosing one's HIV status. Almost half of CHIWO's participants reported food insecurity. This is another intersectional barrier that researchers have demonstrated in meta-analyses is associated with lower CD4 count and detectable viral load. So when we take into consideration intersecting forms of stigma and food insecurity, we can see that reaching a detectable viral load is challenging. I was in the Northwest Territories in December, where I've been working on collaborative research for the past 6 years with an Indigenous sexual health agency. And I was there 2 weeks after the change on December 1st in HIV, the non-disclosure directive for Canada. So the territories are actually the only place where this change, so if someone has an undetectable viral load, they don't need to do the condom use and the disclosure. So the only place that this might be immediately experienced is in the territories because it impacts federal prosecutors who handle territorial prosecutions. So I was asked to talk to CBC North on the radio. And I argued that there should be no criminalization of non-disclosure regardless of viral load or condom use. There are too many barriers for persons to access support, dignity, and care. And the law is not going to change this. So I think the non-disclosure directive could go further. We need to trust people are doing the best they can to navigate their situations and work to remove stigma and structural barriers. And the actual person doing the interview said to me, so you mean we should just trust people? I'm like, yes, we should just trust people are doing their best to manage their health and the health of the people around them. So I'm like, yes. So I have some final thoughts. Across these 3 case examples, I've hoped to demonstrate how context of criminalization constrain negative sexual rights. So a negative sexual right is our freedom from violence and our access to justice, and positive sexual rights, sexual expression, choice of sex partners, and access to services. Second is intersectionality matters. We can see the shared and different experiences across sexual and gender identities and the role of gender, HIV, and racial discrimination. And third, criminalization, whether due to sexual orientation and gender identity, sex work, or HIV, it contains people in ways that limit their human rights. And this reflects the concept of structural chronicity, coined by Weidman, socially constructed beliefs, practices, and material cultures that contain the human body in particular situations and life experiences. This containment of our bodies is physical, psychological, political, and economic. And it produces stressors that harm our health and our opportunities in our lives. And so to end, I want to bring us back to where I began when I talked about the liberatory potential of intersectionality. So while many people think about the intersection of stigma and discrimination as being inherently oppressive, we also have to recognize that the intersection of identities has so much potential. So the Combahee River Collective also stated, merely naming the pejorative stereotypes, in this case attributed to Black women, let alone cataloging the cruel, often murderous treatment we receive, indicates how little value has been placed in our lives. We realize that the only people who care enough about us to work consistently for our liberation is us. Our politics evolve from a healthy love for ourselves, our sisters, and our community, which allow us to continue our struggles and our work. So I would like us to remember that there is love, solidarity, resistance, and struggle for social justice that we can all join in on. And I just want to acknowledge funders, and feel free to contact me. And thank you for the invitation. I realize I talked very fast, so I apologize.
So I really want to open it up for questions and discussion now. What I might ask, Carmen, would you be able to repeat just into the mic so we have it for our video recording, which will be posted on our website, the questions as they come in?
Yes,
so they're
sure.
Able to capture. So we've got some time to discuss your questions.
Great.
First up, I know there's some people really dying out. Yes. Can you just identify yourself?
You mentioned the undetectable equals the transmissible threat. Obviously, yes, it's geared towards male, and we are always running behind. Is your perception that this might change the way things will happen in the future, or still the self-esteem, the colonization, the inherent colonization attitudes that probably most of us have, that have to you go through life trying to erase those from you. What do you think that might change and leave a positive impact in the future, or will we constantly, in your opinion, controlled by men?
I try to have a critical, hopeful perspective. So your question is, or generally is PrEP and. Because Jeannie said I need to repeat your question, so I'm trying to repeat it. So will PrEP and U equals U change the stigma women experience? I think that it's hopeful the more options people have to manage their health. So I totally think PrEP is wonderful and obviously extremely effective option, and U equals U is a very hopeful message as well. That's very empowering. So I think those technologies in and of themselves might not erase gender-based violence. So I think we need concurrent structural interventions to challenge racism and gender-based violence and sexism and transphobia and homophobia and sex work stigma and drug use stigma. So I think they're necessary but not sufficient to transform people's lives. Pardon me? Yeah, I think that there's still a lot of barriers to accessing PrEP, and that I'm not completely familiar with the BC context, but it's not free. So as long as it's not free, it's free in BC. So in Ontario, it's not. So that's wonderful. So in Ontario, it's not free. So people, like I work with a lot of trans women, and they have to take part in clinical trials in order to access PrEP right now. So until it's free for everybody, but it's still you're still gonna have to navigate violence. I mean, I woke up this morning to find out an 11-year-old girl was murdered yesterday in Ontario, and just was like, wow, we have so much to go when it comes to violence. So just to consider, yes, PrEP is amazing, and people still live in precarious contexts that might limit their ability to adhere to PrEP, access PrEP. So yes, PrEP is awesome, and we can't forget about the structural inequalities. So, thanks.
Another question? I have one.
Okay.
Think of the questions, everyone. Carmen, you talked today about some of your thinking and your work around intersectionality as something more than just a collision of oppressions. And I wondered if you could talk with us today, because I think that's going to be very fresh, theoretical, and I hope as we operationalize these ideas, things that will bring intersectionality into like action for positive change. Mm-hmm. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that for us today, taking us away from this idea of this collision of oppressions and moving us towards like very powerful collisions of
Yeah, I'm so passionate about this because I think it's very disempowering to just focus on marginalization, because the same identities that intersect, that produce marginalization, also produce opportunities and connections with one another. And so, the very first thinking I did around intersectional stigma was like at the structural level, people are advocating. And even if advocating means educating your doctor so that the next person who walks in doesn't experience the same thing as you, that's a structural intervention that an individual is doing to help out their people with similar life experiences. And I think there's this notion of reciprocity that is so profound. I'll just tell you a story from the work with Black Cap that really moved me. So Toronto gets really cold in the winter. Really, really cold, like snow and blizzards. And we're sitting here, and there was a story about, and so we have this complicated system. When you get on a bus, you put a token in. Now we have this thing called Presto, but it's really new. So you put a token in, and then you need to get a transfer. And if you don't get the transfer and you go to a subway stop, they won't let you in. So then So what was happening was some of the people in the focus group were saying that they didn't know that they were supposed to get a transfer when they came to Canada. Nobody really told them that. So you'd go to a group and someone would give you 2 tokens. It would take you 2 to get home, and then you'd still not have tokens. You wouldn't have enough tokens because you didn't know to get the transfer. And so people were like sharing that information with each other. When they saw somebody not getting a transfer, anybody, they didn't even know. They're like, as soon as they knew that you needed a transfer, they would say, do you know you need a transfer to get there? Just like really basic information but it's actually structural, right? It's our transportation. It's so really providing this information. Even I went to one of the Rainbow Sisters is a group for a Black couple has for lesbian, bisexual, trans women, also women living with HIV. And the amount of information sharing about what was a good lawyer if people were seeking asylum, about people like not getting a job interview, and then people providing that support, like, you know what, you're going to get the next one. So I think there's all this reciprocity and solidarity that we're not necessarily recognizing is actually key to people's survival much more than us. So any group intervention I've ever done, I realize has so much less to do with whatever I provided than just providing a space for people to connect and share wisdom and support everywhere. So I think that intersectionality perspective should necessarily also be a hopeful perspective, a critically hopeful perspective about our ability to take care of ourselves and one another in our fight for social justice. So, yeah, I'm really, I'm doing a review of the intersectional stigma literature right now. So I'm like, how often are people looking at resistance and resilience and solidarity and advocacy? Because people are doing it, and if we don't document it, it doesn't mean it's not happening. It just means we're missing that piece out.
Thank you very much. Yes, Rodney. Please introduce yourself.
Yes. So I would say the example I just gave of people like really helping each other out, but of coming to these groups, like one time they were saying there was like a blizzard, like a real bad blizzard, and people still came out to this group. There was flooding to provide support to each other. And another example is that some people discussed enjoying each other's company so much from the group that they rode the subway to the other end of the city the wrong way, just to keep the conversation going. So I think that that resilience manifests in navigating these immigration stressors, but bringing people along. So really like providing that emotional support, the tangible, the logistical support. I'm happy to share the article. Like I'm trying to like remember. We looked at it as being multi-level though, as being like interpersonal, inter and structural, and ways that people would learn how to finally be accepted also, like, and not fear, like being open and being out about sexual or gender identities, but also not painting Canada as this perfect place, void of like xenophobia and racism. So there was this kind of slight disappointment, I think, that there was still new barriers and new forms of marginalization, and not just like welcome, It was like welcome kind of for some people, some places, So, but I think just like that process of navigating it, and really that reciprocity is something I've been thinking a lot about. How that solidarity often looks like, oh, someone helped me out, I'm going to help the next person out. Like it really was a major finding, I think.
So we have a host of questions now. I'm going to go with Dr. Wendy Norman and Dr. Carmen. They're going to come to you.
Sure, it doesn't get answered by this one.
All right, great.
Carmen, thank you for that presentation. I'm Wendy Norman. That was a wonderful body of work and a really lovely, well-articulated presentation on the intersection of so many different barriers and difficulties that these populations face. I can't help myself from thinking from a systems perspective of the hope that you must foster in your heart to continue on in this work. And I just wanted to pose a hypothetical question for you. If you had 2 minutes in an elevator with somebody that you think could make a significant difference somewhere in the system, would that be a media person or a health professional educator or maybe a legislator of some sort? Who would it be and what would you tell them?
Can you be more specific what change I would want them to make? I'm buying some time here while I think about the answer.
Yeah, so in all of what you've learned, what do you see as a primary addressable barrier from a system point of view, and who is it going to take to make a difference?
I think the biggest barrier is in ourselves. I think that we are part of the people who vote, the people in power. We are the people who are in relationship with communities. And so I think that a lot of what I've been thinking about and starting to write about is how often we need to change. So we think, you know, in at least in HIV and sexual health research, that there are people who are, in quotes, like hard to reach. Like nobody is hard to reach, it's we're not doing the work in the right way. Because that person can reach who they want to reach when they want to reach them. They just don't want to reach us. And so why is there this gap between us and policymakers? Well, we need to be better at bridging that gap. Why is there a gap between us and communities that we work with if we don't belong to that community? Well, we better be better at building real, authentic relationships. So I would say that we are the ones that are constantly going to need to look at our own biases, our blind spots, and really reach out and try to change other people in our own worlds that we have relationships with, as long as we've changed ourselves first. But if we're looking at people who are doing oppressive things, or, you know, how can we actually build an authentic relationship? Because I think so much, as long as we think that it's a problem that somebody else can fix, then we're not like in it. And we are in it, but we need to be really aware of how every interaction I have with, you know, somebody driving a taxi and they ask me where I'm going, and I say I'm going to an HIV conference, is an opportunity for me to talk about HIV. So I often talk about LGBT stuff, and it's an opportunity to, not always, because sometimes you're tired, but a lot of times it's that those constant, you know, conversations when it's appropriate and you have the energy, but also how do we build our work in a way that keeps building alliances. So a lot of what we're trying to start doing in Brazil is to say we are all working in silos. How do we really build alliances between, you know, sex workers, LGBTQ folks, HIV activists, and abortion rights activists? So that's like an example of what we're doing in Brazil. And a lot of that is looking at our own biases towards each other and towards different groups, and not seeing the common struggles and how all of our oppression is interconnected, although experienced differently. Our privilege is also experienced differently. So I think part of it is really trying to break down those, you know, even in that stigma model that I was sharing with you, it took about 6 months for the group to agree that we need to not create a target of stigma and a stigmatizer as being separate. So that model has them both in the same model. We both can experience stigma and perpetuate it in the same body, you know? So it's really trying to think like, there's not like these stigmatizers over here and these victims over here. We're much more complex than that. So I would just say, like, let's think about how we can build more relationships with people making the structures, or you know, engage people in voting so that you know, we don't have Doug Ford, right? Like in Ontario. So.
Okay, 2 more questions.
Thanks, Carmen, for a great talk. My name is Travis Sawe, and my question, I really liked what you said about migration and just sort of reminding us about how we are connected to all of these other international contexts. And I wondered if in any of your research, but in particular the newcomer study, if you learned anything that would be applicable to policy around asylum in Canada. And one thing that struck me, I know very little about asylum law, but as I'm learning more and more about it, it occurs to me that you're maybe required to make a case for the basis on which you were being persecuted in your country of origin. And since you're here talking about intersectionality, I wondered, did you hear ways in which maybe those policies, particularly Canadian federal policies on asylum, might be altered, keeping in mind the fact that people don't just experience marginalization on the basis of one identity?
Thanks, Travis. That's a really amazing and tough question. I think the main challenge to the asylum pieces is having to demonstrate your kind of queerness or your transness or your LGBTQ-ness when it was hidden. So for survival. So it's this kind of real tension between needing to make it a claim and prove things back in a place where maybe you were totally underground. And I remember like really what made me really kind of blown away was doing a focus group with lesbian, bisexual, and queer women living with HIV. And they were all like from like Caribbean. It just happened to be because maybe it was Women's Health, Women's Hands Community Health Center and who they service, but they were all African and Caribbean women, and one woman talking about, somebody burned her house down in Kenya, and she has like nothing, like no documents, nothing of her partner, like nothing. And so how do you, who do you like go to create this kind of case to prove that you had a life that was maybe very hidden? So yeah, it's a bit complicated. I know, and I mean, working with the lawyers, which is something that was very new for me, just the way that they had to like, what's the likelihood that this person would be persecuted by police if they went back? And I was like, I don't know if I can say that. I can show you what we found. But, this certainty that is required by the law, the certainty, like to prove a certainty is challenging because life is like not that simple. So, yeah.
Well, we're breaking down causality anyway. So.
Well, my question was kind of answered way back, but I just, I really like what you said about the commonalities, and I think from a clinical perspective, one of the patients, what I often hear is like, it's a me, and so that bring that intersectional voice in to think about how we can collaborate, and often, when we come to talks like this, we're here with all these people who, I guess it's challenging I find this, we're here with all these people who believe in this and have a passion for this, and I struggle to look at strategies of how we bring people together that don't think these messages apply to them, or, like you said, bringing in, the pro-choice activists and bringing everyone together. And I don't know if I have a question, but I wonder just strategies around like, how do we do that to ensure that people don't feel that social isolation or that, because really we are so connected on so many levels, and, it's underlying, but we don't get the right people together almost, and we break that down.
Yeah, I think it's really, so how do we bring people together, and then how do we bring different kind of movements together? I think bringing people together, every time I've done a focus group, people have said, well, so when can we come back?
Yeah.
So I wish that there was just more spaces and small resources where we could bring people together for a focus group, and then if people wanted to connect with each other, they could keep coming back, because there's something really powerful in that connection people have with not feeling alone. I remember I did a focus group in Hamilton, which is a smaller city outside of Toronto. Imagine none of the women living with HIV had ever met each other. And they were exchanging numbers at the focus group, and it was like, wow. They were like, oh my gosh, there's other people. That it took research to do like a focus group, and then for people to make those connections. And then we're developing some strategies using, I know Dr. Cruci does digital storytelling for the work in Brazil, but really thinking about, and some of my racial justice colleagues have said, it's not enough just to bring people together and say work together. You need to make sure that, everybody checks their biases against abortion. If you're going to ask people to work together, everyone checks their biases about sex work, and how do we do that? And so there is work around how do we look at what we've learned, how do we unpack it and unlearn it, and really think about intersectionality. If we're going to do movement building, we need to be able to be aware of where those gaps are. And we can't be thinking we're fighting for funds, like there's limited resources, because there's actually so little research, I realized, on sustainable cross-movement building. So how do we work across movements in a sustainable way? So part of it's what we're doing is sort of what does it really mean to work with somebody that from a community I'm not necessarily connected to? And so really doing that, that work about our own social constructions of whatever topic it is, whether it's around abortion or LGBT rights or sex worker rights or HIV. So to really look at our own stigma before we can come together and work together. So, and how we do that, maybe to look at the common threads of what are we all working on that's the same goal? How do we come together to work for a similar goal, even though we're coming from different positions? Thanks.